Hi everyone, and welcome to this tutorial all about paper 2 question 4. This is for the AQA GCSE in English language, and this task, as some of you might know already, is about comparing writers' perspectives. This is the second video that I've done about this question, and I'll put the link to the first, which was quite a simple introduction really, in the description underneath. For this video, I'm going to start just by explaining the difference between question 2 and question 4, because sometimes students don't know the difference between the two, and what they will do is they will end up writing a question 2 response for a question 4, and you will get limited marks for that because you're not really answering the question, you're not really hitting the assessment objective. So I want you to look at these two bullet points. The top bullet point uses that word summarise, which is really what question 2 is after. It's after a summary from you. And question 2 will say things like summarise the differences between Megan's and Vanessa's holiday. So you've got two extracts because this is a comparison task, and you have to factually compare the two holidays. So one might be in Greece, the other might be in Spain, one had a swimming pool, one didn't, and so on. So you can easily imagine getting two extracts which were about maybe going on holiday. So that's something that you would do for question 2, the summary question. You shouldn't be writing the same for question 4, and you should also not be answering it or looking at the extracts in the same way either for question 4, because even though you're using the same extracts and you're comparing again, you're actually comparing something completely different. This time you're looking really at the writers themselves and their viewpoints. So if we think of that same task about holidays, compare Megan's and Vanessa's viewpoints about their holidays. So you can see we've now got that word viewpoint in there, which is another word for perspective. We're not therefore comparing the holidays, we're comparing and commenting on what each writer thinks about their holiday. So we're taking into consideration their opinions of it. Maybe one didn't like it because the hotel was rubbish. Maybe the other one did like it because it had a nice swimming pool. So for this question 4 task, you must bear in mind that you're not comparing factually what they're saying. What you're doing is you're comparing their viewpoints about what they're saying. You're comparing their opinions and you're comparing the methods by which those opinions are made clear to us as readers. And by methods, I mean language. So before you even attempt question 4, which is obviously worth twice as many marks as question 2, it's really important that you know the difference between the two tasks and don't get confused between them. And hopefully this video might help with that. Whenever I teach question 4 with my students, I familiarise them with quite a simple 5-step cycle, and this is it really. So the first thing that I will say to students is you need to read the question before you read the extracts, because then you will save time because you'll know what evidence you're looking for. So always read the question first and then read the extracts. Once you have read the extracts, you need to ask yourself whether the writer has a positive or a negative viewpoint about what they're saying, and the language will be the clue. So for step 2, once you've ascertained whether it's a positive or negative viewpoint, which is quite broad, which is deliberate, you then need to find the quotes that has led you to make that decision. So, in other words, if you believe that they have a positive attitude, what quotes prove that? So step 2 is to actually highlight the quotes. Step 3 is to bring in some of the methods, or how do the writers present their perspectives or their views. So here we're talking about language. We might have particular use of simile or metaphor or adjective or noun or hyperbole or a particular sentence type like exclamative or imperative. So methods mean language, but it can also mean sentence constructions and structure as well. But students tend to use language more. Once you've looked at those quotes that you've highlighted and labelled some language devices in them, the next thing to do is think about how you would describe the attitudes or the feelings of those writers. So they might be cynical, they might be joyful, they might be ecstatic, they might be judgmental, they might be disapproving, they might be cynical, and so on. So it's important to write down some words that you would use to describe the way in which the writers feel about what they're talking about. And again, it's the language that will drive that forward. In the previous video, I used something called the feelings wheel, which is a resource which is full of about 50 different adjectives that we use to describe an attitude. So again, they might be quite useful, but it's important because that's really what the question is asking, is to use those feelings words, because that's in essence what you are comparing in this question. And finally, in order to climb up the mark scheme, it's important that you ask yourself, why do the writers feel this way? Who are they? Which means, what are their backgrounds? What are their perspectives? What has happened to them, which has made them think this stuff? And then tie that into your analysis. So to give you an example, we all see society differently based on who we are. Our age, our class, our education, our politics, our beliefs, our race, our sexual orientation, whether we have any disabilities, our religion, all of these things are different for all of us. So it's these combination of things which determines our perspective of the world, which means that you can have the same issue, but two people thinking about that issue and talking about that issue in completely different ways, showing completely different opinions because of their backgrounds and their experiences. So it's always a good idea for question 4 to use the information that AQA gives you in the little box above the extract, which is like a little synopsis, which tells you who the writer are and what's going on. So always use that little box. Sometimes it's overlooked, sometimes. Because the details in that little box might tell you how they see things. So to give you an example, recently I looked at an extract with students which one writer was a mother and she was talking about children. So you would expect a mother to see, to have an opinion formed through the lens of parenthood, which might not be the case if you're dealing with a writer who isn't a parent. So our experiences and our past and who we are as people will determine our opinion sometimes, and that can sometimes be useful to think about when you're asking yourself why and trying to expand on why the writers might have the particular perspective that they have in the extracts. Okay, so that five-step formula or cycle is the same and can be the same for every single extract that you look at for this question. Okay. So now that we have understood how to approach this task, we're now going to apply this to two sets of extracts. One of which is which are these two about modern art, and the second two which is about train travel. So I've got a typical question 4 task there. Compare the writer's different perspectives about modern art, 16 marks. So we've got source A on the left, which is in blue, and which is a letter. And we have source B, which is in pink on the right, which is, again, from another adult, but is probably part of maybe an article. And what we're going to do is we're going to approach these two extracts using that 5-step formula in order to get all the information that we need in order to write a decent response. I'm going to finish this video by showing you 2 examples of how to put it all together. So if we look at source A first, it says, Dear Mr. Tinsham, I read with concern your recent article on the new wave of art reaching British shores. With all due respect, I see it as nothing short of an abomination. It is created with a flagrant disregard for the conventions and traditions of classical art. These artists seem not to have learnt from their predecessors, but instead insist on violating their canvases with an assault of colour, which to view, in perfect honesty, is simply excruciating. So the first thing you've got to ask yourself is, based on the language and the tone that this writer creates in this extract, is it a positive viewpoint or a negative viewpoint about modern art? And then just park that answer to one side for a second while we look at the source B. So source B, it says the London art scene has rarely been so exciting. We are seeing a real influx of artists who aren't afraid to throw off the iron shackles of traditional art and champion self-expression. They're rule breakers, not intimidated by the giants of the past. They're revolutionaries, constantly looking forward, never back. Only by pushing the boundaries of modern art are we going to see any progression in the medium? When art conforms, it stagnates, and these new experimenters understand that. So again, you need to ask yourself first, based on the tone and the language of that one on the right there in the pink box, does the writer there have a positive or a negative view of modern art? And it's the language that will be the clue. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that source A on the left is negative and source B on the right is positive. How do we know that? We know that because of the language. And that's why the examiner says we must take into account the methods and tie that into our comparison of the perspectives. Okay. So in summary, we have a writer who really hates modern art and one who really likes it. So we have a complete difference in opinion here about the same thing. Remember, for question 4, we're not comparing the art or the museums in which that art is held. We are purely comparing what the writer's attitudes are about that art. So we need to zoom into source A now and think about methods and quotes. So I have underlined and put in bold some of the key quotes, or pretty much all of them actually, that you can refer to in your response to prove that the writer of this article has a negative attitude about modern art. So we've got nouns like abomination and concern. We have adjectives like flagrant, well, a phrase like flagrant disregard, and an adjective like excruciating. We have the verb violating, and we have the metaphor an assault of colour. So you can see there we've got the quotes, which is step 2 of that cycle, and we've got the methods, which I've labelled, which is step 3. So I need to tie all of that in to my response for this source. It's those underlined words which tells me what their attitude is. If we then go across to source B, again the same, we've got the quotes which have been underlined and put in bold, but also the methods which I've labelled there with the arrows. So we've got the adjective exciting, we've got verb champion, as if to really celebrate something. We've got the metaphor iron shackles of traditional art, which suggests that the writer here is celebrating the fact that these artists are moving away from tradition and taking art in a new direction. And we've also got the nouns revolutionaries and progression. So again, you can see that the language is very, very clear. This is a very positive perspective, a very positive viewpoint that the writer depicts in this article. Both articles are written from a first-person perspective, which is what you would expect with opinions. So you can tie in the fact to your introduction of this response that they are written in first person, which gives us an idea that they're writing from personal memory and experience. So the I is something common for this response, actually. They tend to always be written in first person. For step 4, if you remember back to our cycle, we now need to consider some of the words that we can use to describe these writers' attitudes about art. So in this table, source A, the writer of source A could be described as having a perplexed attitude, a dismayed viewpoint, a worried opinion, resentful, angry, remorseful, revolted, loathing. So those words describe the writer's perspective. That is in complete contrast to the perspective and viewpoint of the writer of source B, who has a much more joyful, eager, hopeful opinion, optimistic attitude, respectful perspective, inquisitive, inspired, positive. So this is really at the heart of your response. This is what the examiner is looking for. Remember, you're not comparing the art, you are comparing what the writers think about that art. And these words are describing how and what they think, really. So completely different attitudes for each. And it's the language that leads us down that path. So for this task, remember, for this exercise, you were not comparing the art, but what each writer thinks of the art. And that's the difference between question 2 and question 4, which is what we started with this session. So you're looking at their opinions, their views, and their perspectives. So that 5-step cycle is the same for whatever the question is. You need to really start by being very simple. Is it positive or negative? Find the quotes that prove what it is. Analyse those quotes for methods. label some feelings words that we've just done in that table, and then expand. Why do they feel this way? What has happened to them to make them come to this opinion? Who are they as people? How do they see the world? What are their backgrounds, for example, which might inform their views on this issue? Okay. So to give you another example, which has just come into my head, fox hunting used to be used a lot as a way to prompt debate in GCSE English. I can remember doing many speaking and listening assessments about fox hunting, which people can have an opinion on. Somebody who hunts foxes is probably going to be pro-fox hunting than somebody who is maybe an animal rights campaigner. So again, who we are as people and our politics and our beliefs will impact on what we say and what opinions we want to present to our audiences, our readers. So it's always important to think about who our writers are as people. And then all of that comes together in a response. And that's what I'm going to show you next. I'm going to show you 3 slides, the first of which is the introduction of the response for this art question. The second slide is paragraph 1 about source A, and the third slide is about source B, which is the third paragraph. And this will now all start to come together to create a response that will get you at least a grade 4. I'm not going to be too specific about what grade it got, but it should be enough to comfortably put you somewhere in the mark scheme between grades 4 to 9, which is obviously consistent with that getting the GCSE. Okay. So here we have an example of the introductory paragraph. This might look a lot, but actually it's because it's typed and it's in about font 20, so it's quite large, so you can see it. But the introduction is always a good idea to really contextualise the extract, and who is speaking, who are the writers, what are their outlooks, who are they? So it says both writers convey different perspectives about modern art. Text A is written as a letter with an intended audience in mind and is not an expert in modern art, resulting in his disdain for modern art. In contrast, text B is an article which has a wider audience, and it is clear that perspective is informed by the writer being an art critic and art lover who is passionate about art. Despite these differences, both texts are written in the first person, conveying personal views, opinions, and experiences. So not only have we put in the first person bit, which shows, that's very much linked to perspective and the conveying of personal belief, they've also tried to expand a bit. So they've spoken about how text B is a bit of an expert maybe in art, an art critic, and therefore he's coming at this art subject from a different professional perspective than maybe text A, the writer of text A, who is maybe not interested in art that much, and is seeing it from maybe just from a normal public perspective, let's say, just a normal member of the public. So that's the introduction. Then we go into the next paragraph, which is about source A. So it says, the writer of text A is clearly dismayed, resentful, and loathing about modern art, demonstrated in part through the use of the verb violating, which suggests that he finds the art is so bad it is painful to observe, and that the blank canvases look better without any paint on them. The noun abomination and adjective excruciating foreground the writer's distaste for modern art and his view that it was very unpleasant to look at. The metaphor in which the writer compares the artwork to an assault of colour suggests the writer doesn't understand the artwork and isn't particularly progressive. It seems he is keener to stay with what he knows and praise traditional art rather than try to appreciate new artwork, which he believes is a waste of time and strange. So this is a good start because they've used words like dismayed, resentful, and loathing, which is labelling really the perspective of the writer. We've then got the methods tied in. We've got verbs and nouns and metaphors as well. So there's clearly effort here on the student's perspective to use methods to help come to a decision about their perspective. And they've also tried to expand at the bottom there about not being progressive. He wants to just basically stay in the past a little bit. He doesn't want to appreciate new stuff. He likes the old stuff. So there is also a sense that they've tried to work out who the writer is and how that impacts on what he feels. Because this is a comparison question, we obviously need to talk about both texts. So the second paragraph, or the next slide, is about text B. And it says, in contrast, a good connective there, in contrast, the writer of source B presents a joyful, optimistic, and inspired attitude towards the modern art that he sees, conveyed through nouns, revolutionaries, and progression, which suggests the writer feels that modern art has taken the art world into an exciting new direction, commending the bravery of modern artists to metaphorically throw off the iron shackles of traditional art. The verb champion suggests the writer is really praising the ideas and creativity of modern artists, and agrees that they should try new things and go in new directions to stop art becoming boring. The fact that he is writing as an art critic suggests he is probably more knowledgeable about art than the writer of source A. So again, finishing there with some personal inference about how the writer himself can impact on what he feels and what he wants to convey. So again, we've got words like joyful, optimistic, inspired, so we're labelling the attitudes or the perspectives. And again, we're tying in the methods. We've got nouns, we have got metaphors, and we have got verbs as well. So there's a real effort there to tie in the methods. So that would be a completed response for 16 marks. Remember, you've got about 20 minutes for this. So actually, by this point, if you're doing the paper 1, 2, 3, 4 in order, you're pretty much now an expert on these extracts because you spent almost an hour on them already and have used them to answer 3 other questions. So by this point, you're already probably hopefully more confident with them than you were at the beginning. So that is one example all about modern art. So for this question, you're not comparing the art itself, you are comparing what the writers think about the art, in other words, their perspective or their attitudes. Okay, and it's the methods and the language itself which will drive you down the route of finding out what their attitudes are. Okay, so we're going to now look at a couple of different short extracts, all about the topic of rail travel and trains and the railways. Similar wording, compare the writer's different attitudes regarding trains and railways. And again, we've got 2 quite short texts. Short because, again, I'm still introducing this question to you. I don't really want to use anything too long for this. And again, we're going to apply the same 5-step approach that we used before with the art extracts. So we have source A here, which is in pink, and source B here, which is in blue. Source A is written from a child's perspective. A child wrote it in the Victorian era, and text B is written from an adult perspective. So that will again affect how they convey their attitudes and also what attitudes they have about railways and trains. So if we look at source A first on the left, the writer says, "Dear Diary, I've had quite a day today. Daddy and I took a trip to see the new steam train, which was being exhibited in James Square. It was fascinating, a clanking, grinding steel colossus, shiny as a new penny, with a great puff of steam that emerged from its funnel and curled into the summer sky. I've never seen the like, and to think, Daddy says one day they may be able to carry people from one end of the country to the other. I, for one, cannot wait." The first question you have to answer is this a positive viewpoint about trains or a negative one? Let's move over to source B. Residents of Station Crescent, I know that you, like me, are plagued day in, day out with the sounds, smells and sights of the railway. Like me, many of you moved here at a time when 3 or 4 trains a day passed by, barely disturbing us at all. And, like me, you've seen our area systematically invaded by a non-stop army of trains, impacting our quality of life, not to mention the price of our homes. The time has come to take a stand against the relentless growth of the railways. So is that writer positive or negative in their attitude about trains? So again, not too difficult, I don't think. The source A writer, the pink there, obviously has a very positive attitude about the trains. Her innocence and her childhood is obviously influencing that. Whereas the writer of source B, the blue, is very negative about living next to trains. So they have, again, 2 completely different attitudes about trains and railways. And they're looking at it from 2 different perspectives as well, based on who they are as people. If we move into step 2, we've now got to find quotes, and for step 3, we've got to find methods. And this is what we have here. So we've got lots of exclamatory sentences in this short extract, which are conveying the writer's passion and, awe-inspired approach to these trains. We've got adjective fascinating. We've got the metaphor colossus, meaning something very, very big. We have verbs clanking and grinding. We have the simile, shiny as a new penny. And it's those methods which convey to us what the writer thinks of the train. This is clearly the first time that she has seen a steam train, and therefore she might not have seen it before, and that is something to do with how she conveys her perspective, or how she thinks about what she thinks of this train. In contrast, the writer of source B has had enough of trains. The problem is he sees too many of them, and that has become the problem. So again, tying in the quotes and the methods for source B, we have the verb plagued. We have the list of 3, sounds, smells and sights. We have the verb invaded, the adjective relentless, and we have the metaphor comparing the trains to a non-stop army. He also tries to persuade fellow residents that live in Station Crescent to take action in the same way that he wants to. He uses an imperative command at the end, it's time to take a stand. And he also repeats the phrase like me, which perhaps he believes if he repeats enough will spur people into action, to maybe sign a petition or protest to try and reduce the number of trains that speed by on the railway by their homes. So the problem is, source A, the writer wants to see more of the train. The writer of source B hates them and has had enough of them. He's fed up with them. Both of them, though, use the first person again, and that's intrinsic to the presentation of their personal viewpoints and attitudes. So we've got their step 2 and 3 complete. We've got the quotes and we've got the methods. We've now got to do step 4. We've got to try and label their attitudes. So we could say that source A has an excited attitude. She's awestruck, optimistic, inspired, fascinated, passionate, riveted. Whereas the attitudes of source B is more angry, critical, judgmental, disapproving, perplexed, pessimistic, tired, and you can also say he has quite a dismayed perspective as well. And again, like we said before, this is important because this is, in effect, what you are comparing for this task. You're not comparing the trains, you're comparing the attitudes of the writers who write about those trains. Okay, so there's a difference. So again, for this response, we need to put all this together. You are not comparing the trains or railways, but what each writer thinks of the trains and railways. In other words, their opinions, their views, and the perspectives. And it's the language and the methods which give us a clue as to what those feelings are. We also need to think about who the writers are as people. So the fact one's a child has some bearing. The fact one is an adult also is important, because the adult, source B, is writing about things that the child probably wouldn't understand, like house prices and things. So this all has to come together again to form our response. So you can pause this video now and have a go at writing the response to these 2 texts about this railway question if you want, based on what we've talked about already, or you can carry on watching and I will show you a model response and how you can put all this information together. So as before, we start with introduction. Both writers convey different perspectives about railways and the trains that use them. Text A is clearly written by a very young child who has never seen a steam train before. To a child's eye, this huge piece of engineering seems like a spectacle and too surreal to comprehend. The child writer would also be oblivious to the noise and nuisance that the train could create. In contrast, the writer of source B is an adult who is using his perspective of someone irritated by the trains near his house to persuade his fellow residents to reduce the number of trains. Despite these differences, both texts are from the first-person perspective, suggesting they are each writing from a personal viewpoint, using their memories, opinions and experiences to inform their attitudes. So their approach, their attitude, is influenced by who they are as people. Next paragraph, the writer of source A is clearly awestruck, excited and fascinated by the sight of the steam train, partly conveyed through the simile in which they state the train is as shiny as a new penny, suggesting the child sees the train as sparkling, enchanting and quite magical. The writer's excitement about the train is also seen through the repetition of exclamatory sentences throughout the text, such as "I've had quite a day today" and "I for one cannot wait," suggesting the child is really looking forward to a new age of steam transportation in the 19th century when Britain was becoming more industrialised. The adjective fascinating sums up the child's perspective, as does the metaphor colossus, which draws attention to the fact the train is a lot more powerful and larger than the writer is, adding to their curiosity and excitement about it. So we've got words like awestruck, excited, and fascinated, which is clearly about their perspective, their attitude. We've got the methods, the simile, the adjectives, exclamatory sentences. So that's also important. But there's also, impressively there, a real attempt to expand on the whys. So, the steam train being a lot larger than the child. Children are often easily pleased or easily kind of awestruck at things that adults might find quite trivial and quite boring. So you might have done for language or literature work on context such as Victorian England. And if you haven't, that would be very useful to do because, clearly where they've talked about Britain being more industrialised is clearly some context. And that can help sometimes enhance your view. Towards in the Industrial Revolution when a lot of factories were built and transportation needed like canals and railways and roads in order to transport those goods. So again, you can introduce some context that might be useful from time to time. Source B, last paragraph, in complete contrast, again a useful discourse marker or connective there. The writer of Source B demonstrates an angry, dismayed and disapproving perspective about living by a railway now that the number of trains have increased since he bought the house. His critical attitude is seen through the verb plagued to describe the trains as if they are a constant, inescapable irritant and he is powerless to stop them. This sense of powerlessness is also implied through the use of the metaphor army of trains, which suggests that his home has been hit by a barrage of trains in a way that has connotations of military force. Despite the tone coming across as a little bit hyperbolic in places, the list of 3, sights, smells and sounds, reinforces the idea his life and home have been made a misery because of the pervasive nature of the railway. So much so, he imperatively asks his fellow residents to take a stand against the relentless attack of the railways. As a resident who is concerned about his house price and quality of life, perhaps he is legitimately concerned about living in close proximity to the railway, which, when he moved there, he felt was more bearable. So again, we've got words like dismayed, angry, disapproving, critical, misery. So again, there's a real sense here that the student is not comparing the trains or the railways, he's comparing what the writers think of the railways. The methods are the clue. We've got some lovely comment about hyperbole in there. We've got some a metaphor in there. We have got a verb, imperative sentence. So again, there's lots of methods and a little bit of analysis there of the language. And then there's also a focus on who the writer is and why he has this view. So in fact, he might want to sell his home and can't, or he has to knock money off the house price. He lived there when the railway was quieter, and now it's become a bit of a nuisance because too many people take the train now, and his home is plagued, as he says, by the sounds and smells of the railway. So it's become a bit of a worry and something to complain about, really. And so clearly the writer is not a train enthusiast, because if he was a train enthusiast, he would not have this perspective. So again, who the writers are will often be the clue as to what perspective and what attitude, what opinion they have. Okay, so that again is another completed response there. And for this video, I deliberately did not use full-length GCSE extracts, because I would do this work at the beginning of this question to introduce students to this question, and then after this I would then start to use proper GCSE extracts, which I will do in future videos, by the way. So in summary then, if I go back to the 5-step cycle, you can use this 5-step cycle every time that you approach this task. Figure out whether the writer has a positive or negative attitude first, be quite broad with that. Then find some quotes, maybe 2 or 3 quotes from each source. Don't need to go overboard with them because you've only got 20 minutes at the end of the day. Then look at the methods that those quotes have. Maybe there's a use of an adjective or a word or a phrase or a sentence type. Then come up with some words to describe their attitudes. Are they, negative? Are they angry, judgmental, critical, or are they positive and are quite jubilant, joyous, happy, and so on? But importantly, try and figure out why they have this view. Who are they as people? Why do they have this opinion? What's happened to them? And I suppose why might you also feel the same if you were in their shoes? So standing in the shoes of the writer can often be a good way as well to enhance the analysis. Because if you pretend that you're also a writer who lives by a railway, you might also feel the same and have the same concerns. Okay, so that is paper 2, question 4, comparing writers' perspectives. Thank you.